Chapter 14. That was all very efficient, Christine said. You're getting good at this sort of thing, aren't you? First the table, then the Evening Post thing, and now this. I didn't used to be, by the way. I hope you don't object too much to the way I got a hold of this taxi. I got into it, haven't I? Yes, I know, but I should have thought the method wouldn't strike you as unethical. It does, at least it would in an ordinary way, but it was more important for us to get a taxi than for them, wasn't it? I'm glad you look at it like that. He brooded on her use of the word important for a moment, then realized that he didn't much care for her easy acquiescence in this piratical treatment of the Barclays taxi. Even he now felt it had been a bit thick, and she presumably hadn't his excuse for wanting a taxi very badly. Like both the pretty women he'd known and many that he'd only read about, she thought it was no more than fair that one man should cheat and another be cheated to serve her convenience. She ought to have objected. She refused to go. She ought to have objected, refused to go with him, insisted on returning and handing the taxi over to the Barclays, walked back, revolted by this unscrupulousness, and into the dance. Yes, he'd have liked that, wouldn't he? A proper champion that would have been, lad. His hand flew to his mouth in the darkness to stifle his laughter, to sidetrack it. He began to still in alarm from the thought that he'd have to find something to talk to this girl about all the way back to the Welches. The only thing he felt out clear about was the fact that this abduction of her was a blow struck against Bertrand, but it seemed less than prudent to begin there. Why had she consented to ditch her boyfriend in this emphatic way? There were several possible answers. Perhaps he could start with that. Did you manage to get away all right, he asked. Oh, yes. Nobody seemed to object very much. What did you say to them? I just explained things to Uncle Julius. He never minds what I do, and then I just told Bertrand I was going. How did he react to that? He said, oh, don't do that. I'll be with you in a minute. Then he went on talking to Mrs. Goldsmith and Uncle, so I came away then. I see. It all sounds very easy and quick. Oh, it was. Well, I'm very glad you decided to come with me after all. Good. I couldn't help feeling guilty rather at first about walking out on them all, but that's worn off now. Good. What finally made you make up your mind? After a silence, she said, I wasn't enjoying it much in there, as you know, and I started feeling awfully tired, and it didn't look as if Bertrand could leave for some time, so I thought I'd come along with you. She said this in her best schoolmistressy way, elocution mistressy, in fact, so Dixon repeated as stiffly. I see. In the light of a street lamp, he could see her sitting, as she expected, on the very edge of the seat. That was that, then. She suddenly broke in again in her other manner, the one he associated with their phone conversation. I'm not going to try and get away with that. It's only a part of it. I don't see why I shouldn't tell you a bit more. I left because I was feeling absolutely fed up with everything. That's a bit sweeping. What had fed you up in particular? Everything. I was absolutely fed up. I don't see why I shouldn't tell you this. I've been feeling very depressed recently. It all seemed to get much for me tonight. A girl like you got no call to be depressed about anything, Christine, Dixon said warmly. Then at once fell against the window and banged his elbow, smarting on the door as the taxi lurched aside in front of a row of petrol pumps. Behind there was an unlit building with a painted sign faintly visible reading Cars for Hire, Batson's Repair. Dixon got out, ran to a large wooden door, and began to pound regularly upon it, wondering whether or how soon to add shouts to his summons. While he waited, he ran over in his mind some handy all-purpose phrases of abusive or menacing tendencies against the appearance of a garageman unwilling to serve him. A minute passed, he went on thumping while the taxi driver slowly joined him, his very presence a self-righteously pessimistic comment. Dixon laid down for himself the general lines of an appropriate face, involving free and unusual use of the lips and tongue, and endorsed by manual gestures. Just then a light sprang up inside, and very quickly the door was opened. A man appeared and declared himself able and willing to serve petrol. During the next couple of minutes, Dixon was thinking not about this man, but about Christine. He was filled with awe at the thought that she seemed not only not to dislike him to any significant extent, but to trust him as well. How wonderful she was, and how lucky he was to have her there. The admissions, the implied confessions about his feelings for her he'd made to Carol had seemed outlandish at the time. Now they seemed perfectly natural and just. The next half hour or so formed the only chance he'd ever have of doing anything whatever about those feelings. For once in his life, Dixon resolved to bet on his luck. What luck had come his way in the past he distrusted, stingingly held on until the chance of losing his initial game was safely past. It was time to stop doing that. Dixon paid the garage man and the taxi moved off. You haven't any reason to be depressed, I was saying, he said. I don't see how you can know that. I don't see how you can know that, she said severely again. No, of course I can't know it, but I shouldn't think you'd have to have too bad a time on the whole. Okay, no, of course I can't know it, but I shouldn't think you have too bad a time on the whole, he said with an ease that surprised him. He could see that she needed time and encouragement to work back to her more open manner, and reflected that this sort of perception was as unfamiliar in him as all other things he was feeling. I'd have put you down as somebody reasonably successful in most things. I didn't mean to sound like a martyr. You're right, of course. I do have a good time, and I've been very lucky in all sort of ways. But, I do find some other things awfully difficult. I don't really know my way around. Dixon wanted to laugh. He couldn't imagine any woman of her age less in need of such lore. He said as much. No, it's perfectly true, she insisted. I haven't had a chance to find out yet. You mustn't mind me saying this, but I should have thought there'd be plenty of people only willing to show you. I know. I see what you mean exactly, but they don't try to. They assume I know already, She was talking animatedly. Oh, they do they? How's that, would you say? I think it must just be because I look as if I'm full of poise and that sort of thing. I look as if I know all about how to behave and all that. 2 or 3 people have told me that, so it must be right, but it's only the way I look. Well, it is true you look fairly sophisticated, if that's the right word, even a bit upstage sometimes, but how old would you say I am? Dixon thought an honest answer would for once be appropriate. About 24, I should say. There you are then, she said triumphantly. Just what I thought. 20 next month, the 18th. I didn't mean, of course, you didn't look very young as far as just your actual face goes. No, I know, but it's the age I seem, isn't it? It's the way I look, isn't it? Yes, I suppose it is, but isn't just that on its own, is it? Sorry, what on its own? I mean, it's not just your appearance that makes you seem older and more experienced and all that. It's the way you behave and talk a lot of time, too, don't you think? Don't you think so? Well, it's awfully hard for me to tell, isn't it? Must be naturally. You seem to keep getting on to your high horse all the time. Hard to describe it exactly, but you have got a habit every now and then of talking and behaving like a governess, though I don't know much about them, I must admit. Or have I? Though the tone of this question illustrated just what he was talking about. Dixon, feeling it couldn't matter what he said that you're doing it now when you don't know what to do or say. You fall back on being starchy, and that all fits in with your face. That's probably what gave you the idea of being starchy in the first place, your face, I mean. And that makes a total effect of prim kind of self-assurance, and you don't want to be prim. But you don't want to be prim, but you do want to be self-assured, yes. But that's quite enough of Uncle Jim's corner. We're getting off the point. How does all this tie up with being depressed? There's still nothing to be depressed about. She hesitated while Dixon sweated slightly, repenting of his burst of old trooper confidence. Then she said with a rush, it's all to do with men, you see. I hadn't had much to do with men till I got my job in London last year. Look, you don't mind talking about me all the time, do you? You seem so self-centered. You don't think? You can forget all that. I want to hear about this. All right, then. Well, I hadn't been working in the bookshop very long when a man got talking to me and asked me to come to a party, so I went, of course, and there were a lot of artist kind of people there, and 1 or 2 ones from the BBC, the sort of thing. I can imagine. So then it all started. I kept being asked out by men, and of course I kept going. It was such marvelous fun, and still I do enjoy it a great deal, but they kept trying to seduce me the whole time. I didn't want to be seduced, you see, and as soon as I convinced them of that, they were off. Well, I didn't mind that much because there always seemed to be another one ready. I bet there did. Go on. I'm afraid this sounds terribly. Go on. Well, if you're quite sure anyway, after a few months of that, I met Bertrand. That was in March. He didn't seem quite like the others, chiefly because he didn't start trying to make me be his mistress the entire time, and he can be very nice, though I don't suppose you after a bit of the thing was I was starting to get rather fond of him, and at the same time, this is the funny part, I was getting a bit fed up with him in other ways while I was still getting more fond of him. He's such a queer mixture, you see. Naming to himself the two substances of which he personally thought Bertrand a mixture. Dixon said, in what way? He can be extremely understanding and kind one minute and completely unreasonable and childish the next. I feel I never know where I am with him or what he really wants. Sometimes I think it's all to do with how he's getting on with his painting. Anyhow, well, with one thing and another, we started having rows, and I can't bear rows, especially because he was always putting me in the wrong by then. How do you mean? He'd start one with me when he could put me in the wrong by starting one and force me to start one when starting one would put whoever started one in the wrong. Okay, he'd start one with me when he could put me in the wrong by starting one, and force me to start one when starting one would put whoever started one in the wrong. There will be one over tonight, of course, and he'll put me in the wrong as usual, but he's in the wrong. He's the one who's wrong. All this business with Mrs. Goldsmith. It's all right, I'm not going to ask you about it, but I know there's something going on there, but he won't tell me what it is. I don't suppose there's anything much. He just gets a bit excited but he won't tell me what's happening. He'll pretend there isn't anything. He'll ask me if I really think he'd get up to anything behind my back, and I'll have to say no otherwise. This is none of my business, Christine, but in my opinion, friend Bertrand's letting himself in for you, giving him the air. This is none of my business, Christine, but in my opinion, But in my opinion, friend Bertrand's letting himself in for you giving him the air. No, I can't do that unless I can't do that. I'm in too deep now to back out like that. I have to go on as it is. You got to take people as you find them. This is none of my business, Christine, but in my opinion, friend Bertrand's letting himself in. Just making me friend. No, I can't do that unless I can't do that. I'm in too deep now to back out like that. It'll have to go on as it is. You got to take people as you find them. Not wanting to speculate what it was and how it was going on, Dixon asked hurriedly, have you and he got anything planned for the future? Well, I haven't, but I think he may. I've got an idea he wants us to get married, though he's never actually mentioned it. And what do you feel about that? Haven't decided yet. This seemed off for the moment. It crossed Dixon's mind that apart from her voice, he no evidence that she was beside him at all. When he turned to his right, he saw only the darkest and most anonymous shape. She held herself so still that there was no sound of movement from clothing and upholstery. She seemed to use no scent or any way he couldn't smell anyway, and he was a long way from being able to think of touching her. The shoulders and hatted head of the taxi driver outlined against the glow of the car's lights, and whose movements controlled their course, were in a way much more real to him. Dixon looked out of the side window, and his spirits rose at once at the sight of the darkened countryside moving past him. This ride, unlike most of the things that happened to him, was something he'd rather have not have. He got something he wanted, and whatever the cost and future embarrassment, he was ready to meet it. He reflected that the Arab proverb urging this kind of policy was incomplete. To take what you want, pay for it. It should add, which is better than being forced to take what you... It should add, take what you want, pay for it, which is better than being forced to take what you don't want and paying for that. It was one more argument to support his theory that nice things are nicer than nasty ones. Christine's unshared presence was a very nice thing, so nice that his feelings seemed overloaded by it like a glutton's stomach. How splendid her voice was to hear more of it, he asked. What are Bertrand's pictures like? Oh, he hasn't shown me any of them. He says he doesn't want me to think of him as a painter until he can think of himself as one, but people have told me they think they are pretty good. They were all friends of his, though, I suppose. Whatever aureole of choking nonsense surrounded this view of Bertrand's, Dixon thought the view itself worthy of some respect, or at least of some surprise. What a temptation it must be to produce proofs of one's status as an artist, to flatter people and at the same time show one was rather a good chap by asking for it and seeming to act on criticism. Above all, to let people know how much more there was in one that met the eye. Dixon himself had sometimes wished he wrote poetry or something as a claim to develop character. Christine had continued, I must say it's something to meet a man who's got some sort of ambition. I don't mean an ambition like wanting to have a date with a film star or something like that. It sounds a funny thing to say, but I look up to Bertrand because he's got something to arrange his life around. Something that isn't just material or self-interested. So it doesn't really matter from that point of view what his work's like. It doesn't matter if what he paints doesn't give any pleasure to a soul apart from himself. But if a man spends his life doing work that only appeals to him, isn't that being self-interested just as much? Self-interested. Well, in a way, everyone's self-interested, aren't they? But you must admit there are degrees of it. I suppose I must, but doesn't this ambition of rather leave you out? What? I mean, you don't find he's painting and so on when you want him to take you out. I mean, don't you find he's painting and so on when you want him to take you out? Sometimes, but I try not to mind that. Why? And of course, I wouldn't dream of letting him see it. It's not an easy situation. Having a relationship with an artist, a very difficult kettle of fish to having a relationship with an ordinary man. Dixon, feeling as he now seemed to have begun to feel about Christine, was bound to think this last remark unwelcome, but he found it objectively nasty as well. Had it been a line from a film, he had reacted much as he did now, namely by making his lemon-sucking face in the darkness. But in a way, it was a relief to find a loophole of adolescent vulgarity somewhere in that impressively mature and refined facade. I don't quite see that, he had to say. Or perhaps I didn't put it too well, but I should have thought that the work an artist does takes so much out of him in the way of feeling and emotion and so on, that he hasn't got much left over for other people, nor if he's any good as an artist, that is. I think he's sort of got special needs, you know, and it's up to others to supply them when they can without too many questions asked. Dixon didn't trust himself to speak, quite apart from his own convictions in the matter. His experience of Margaret had been more than enough to render repugnant to him any notion of anyone having any special needs for anything at any time, except for such needs as could be readily gratified with a tattoo of kicks on the bottom. And he realized that Christine must perhaps unconsciously be courting her boyfriend or some horrible book lent by her boyfriend, whose desire to arrange himself with children, neurotics, and invalids by thus specializing his needs was not, at the moment, worth attacking. Dixon frowned until a minute ago she'd been behaving and talking so reasonably that it was hard to believe she was the same girl as had helped Bertrand, that had helped Bertrand abate him at Welch's arty weekend. It was queer how much color women seemed to absorb from their men friends, or even from the man they were with for the time being. That was only bad when the man in question was bad. It was good when the man was good. It should be possible for the right man to stop, or at least hinder her from being a refined, gracious liver and arty rubbish talker. Did he think he was the right man for that task? Ha 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 ha, if he did. Jim, Christine said. Dixon's scalp pricked sharply at this. The first, use of his Christian name. Yes, he said wearily. He shrugged his bottom along the seat a little way. You've been very decent to me tonight, letting me ramble on about yourself, and you seem to have your head screwed on the right way. Would you mind if I asked your advice on something? No, not at all. You must realize, though, that I'm asking you just because I want to hear your advice, not for any other reason, she paused and added. Have you got that? Yes, of course. What is this? From what you've seen of us both, do you think it would be a good thing if I got married to Bertrand? Dixon felt a slight twinge of distaste he couldn't quite account for. Isn't that rather up to you? Of course it's up to me. I'm the one who's going to marry him or not marry him. I want to know what you think. I'm not asking to be told what to do. Now, what do you think? This was clearly the moment for a burst of accurate shelling from Dixon in his Bertrand war, but he found himself reluctant to fire. A reasoned denunciation of the foe, followed up by a short account of his recent conversation with Carol, would stand a good chance of bringing total victory in this phase, or at least inflicting heavy losses. He felt, however, that he didn't want to do it like that, and only said slowly, I don't think I know either of you well enough. To hell, man. Had she picked that up from Uncle Julius, Dixon wondered, you're not being asked to do a thesis on it for your doctorate, as Carol might have done. She pinched his arm too hard, making him cry out, saying to him in vocal italics, what do you think? Well, I must say that I think, yes, of course, that's what I asked for, isn't it? Do you get on with it? Do get on with it. Well, then I should say no, I see. Why not? Because I like you and I don't like him. Is that all? It's quite enough. It means much. It means each of you belongs to the two great classes of mankind, people I like and people I don't. It sounds a bit thin to me. All right, if you want reasons. Remember, they're my reasons, though. That doesn't mean to say they oughtn't be yours as well. Bertrand a bore. He's like his dad. The only thing that interests him is him. On any issue you care to mention, he can't do otherwise than ignore your side of things. He just can't do otherwise, see? It's not just him first and you second. He's the only bloody runner. My God, what you said about him putting you in the wrong by starting Rose shows you got his number. I don't see why you have to have someone else to say it for you. She said nothing for a moment, then spoke rather in her censorious manner. Even if that were true, it needn't prevent me from marrying him. Yes, I know women are all dead keen on marrying men they don't like much. But I'm saying why you ought to marry him, not whether you want to or are you going or you're not. I think that once the things that are supposed to wear off, you'll have a hell of a time. You couldn't trust a fellow with your best. I mean, he'd always be having Rose, and you say you don't like Rose. Are you in love with him? I don't much care for that word, she said, as if rebuking a foul-mouthed tradesman. Why not? Because I don't know what it means. He gave a quiet yell. Oh, don't say that. No, don't say that. It's a word you must often have came across in conversation and literature. Are you going to tell me it sends you flying to the dictionary each time? Of course you're not. I suppose you mean it's purely personal. Sorry, go get the jargon right. Purely subjective. Well, it isn't, is it? Isn't it? Yes, that's right. You talk as if it's the only thing that is. If you can tell me whether you like green gauges or not. You can tell me whether you're in love with Bertrand or not, if you want to tell me, that is. You're still making it much too simple. All I can really say is that I'm pretty sure I was in love with Bertrand a little while ago, and now I'm rather less sure. That up and down business doesn't happen with green gauges. That's the difference. Not with green gauges, agree, but what about rhubarb, eh? What about rhubarb? Ever since my mother stopped forcing me to eat it, rhubarb and I have been conducting a relationship that can swing between love and hatred every time we meet. Every time my mother stops forcing me to eat it. That's all very well, Jim. The trouble with love is it gets you in such a state you can't look at your own feelings dispassionately. That would be a thing if you could do it, wouldn't it? Would it? Why, of course. He gave another quiet yell, this time some distance above Middle C. You got a long way to go, if you don't mind me saying so, even though you are nice. By all means, view your own feelings dispassionately, if you feel you ought to, but that's nothing to do with deciding whether Christ, you're in love. Deciding that's no more difficult than the green gauges business. What is difficult, and the time you really need this dispassionate rubbish, is deciding what to do about being in love if you are, whether you can stick the person you love enough to marry them, and so on. Well, that's exactly what I've been saying in different words. Words change the thing, and anyway, the whole procedure is different. People get themselves all steamed up about whether they're in love or not and can't work it out, and their decisions go all to pot. It's happening every day. They ought to realize that the love part's perfectly easy. The hard part is the working out, not about love, but about what they're going to do. The difference is that they can get their brains going on that. The difference is that they can get their brains going on that instead of taking the sound of the word love as a signal for switching them off. They can get somewhere instead of indulging in a sort of orgy of emotional self-catechizing about how you know you're in love and what love is anyway and all the rest of it. You don't ask yourself what green gauges are or how you know whether you like them or not, do you? Right? Outside his lectures, this was the longest speech Dixon had made for what seemed to him for years, and not excluding his lectures, by far the most fluent. How had he managed it? Drink? No. He was dangerously sober. Sexual excitement? No. In italic capitals. Visitations of that feeling reduced him punctually to silence and, as a rule, petrifaction. Then how? It was mystery, but one he felt too consented to bother about solving. He looked idly at the ribbon of road ahead of them, unsteadily unreeling itself beneath the wheels. Hedges, bleached to a sandy pallor by the headlights, swung past, dipping and mounting. The isolation of the car's interior seemed comforting and natural. A movement of Christine's, the first he noticed since the journey began, made him glance in her direction. He could see that she was leaning forward and looking out of the window. She said in a muffled voice, and the same applies to not liking green gauges, of course. Yes, I suppose so. He heard her yawn. Where are we now, do you know? Oh, just over halfway, I should think. I feel awfully sleepy. It is wretched. I don't want to be. Have a cigarette. That'll do a power of good. No, thanks. Look, would you mind if I had a nap for a few minutes? It'll make me feel much less tired, I know. Of course, by all means. While she snuggled herself together in a corner, Dixon fought his disappointment at this device of hers for quitting his company. He thought he was getting on so well. His usual policy of not talking at length was the right one after all. Just then she laid her head on his shoulder, and all his senses grew alert. You don't mind, do you? She asked. The back of the seat's like iron. You go ahead, forcing himself to act before he could think. He slid his arm beneath her shoulder. She moved her head experimentally to and fro against him, then settled herself and seemed to go to sleep at once. Dixon's heart began to pound a little. How now had the evidence he wanted that... Dixon's heart began to pound a little. He now had all the evidence he wanted that she was there. He could sense her breathing, her temple against his jaw, and her shoulder under his hand were warm. Her hair smelled of well-brushed hair. He could feel the presence of her body. It was a pity it wasn't set off by the presence of her mind. It occurred to him that she'd done this merely as a maneuver to arouse his desire, and arouse it for no purpose beyond that of somehow feeding her vanity. Then he rejected so familiar and contemptible a notion. She was too trustworthy for that. She'd just been tired. That was all. The taxi swung round a bend, and he braced himself with his foot to maintain his position in hers. He couldn't go to sleep himself, but he could see to it that she stayed asleep. Cautiously and contortedly, he got hold of the matches and cigarettes and lit one of each in succession. More than ever, he felt secure. Here he was, quite able to fulfill his role. And as with others' roles, the longer you played it, the better chance he had of playing it again. Doing what you wanted to do was the only training and the only preliminary needed for doing more of what you wanted to do. Next time he saw Mitchie, he'd be much less respectful to him. Next time he saw Atkinson, he'd talk to him more. He'd get some sense out of the Catan fellow about his article. Gingerly, he moved a little closer to Christine. Presently, the driver slid the glass aside and asked in a servile tone for more instructions, which Dixon gave. At last, the taxi stopped at the end of the track that led up to the Welch house. Christine woke up and said after a moment, "Are you coming up? I wish you would, because I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get in. The maid lives out, I think." "Of course I'll come up," Dixon said. He settled a brief exchange with the taxi driver by refusing to discuss the question of payment until the taxi should be standing outside outside his. Wait. "Of course I'll come up," Dixon said. He settled the exchange with the taxi driver by refusing to discuss the question of payment until the taxi driver should be standing outside Dixon's digs, then went off into the darkness with Christine, holding onto his arm like a staff. Wow, chapter 14. I'm on chapter 15 now, but this was chapter 14. Here we go.